everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Oncology Data Advisor. Today, I'm joined by three of our editorial board members, Lauren Ghazal, Joe Kalis, and Megan Claire Chase. And today, we're having this episode in honor of National Grief Awareness Day. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ghazal to take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Ghazal. I, like many others in this space, wear several hats. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Rochester in the School of Nursing. I'm a family nurse practitioner and I practice in primary care. And I'm also a young adult cancer survivor. But I think that, my reasons to join this call and to have a discussion with you all here today actually was built on two deaths that I experienced back to back the same day. So August 25th is forever ingrained in my head. But it was of a close friend's brother who died from a cancer, and then the year after, an 18-year-old cousin who died by suicide. And I, as a cancer survivor, had a lot of complicated grief with that because those were also in late 2020 and 2021. So the midst of the pandemic. And so that also presented a lot of grief in that a complicated grieving in that we couldn't grieve as a big Middle Eastern family like we normally would. It was a small funeral. It was, through Zoom for one of them too. And so there was a lot of processing that I felt like I needed to do on my own. So thankful to a therapist, thankful to friends and family who really supported my self-care and my grieving in the complicated process that it is. I think as a researcher, I know logically the stages of grieving, right? We know like that DABDA acronym, the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we know that it's not a really steady stream, right? It's not just unidirectional. And especially with my cousin who died by suicide, a lot of questioning of, where were the signs? What could I have done? And a lot of complicated grief that I carried over from friends who died of the same cancer that I had. And a lot of questions of just what more could I have done to prevent this for others, to prevent this grief for others. So that's a little bit about me and what I chose. And so I want to just thank you all. Thank you. Thank Kira. Thank the I3 Health team too for creating this space. Because recognizing, this own day on August 30th, I think is so monumental and such a need for that time for yourself to process just the enormity of loss that we all experience and grief that we all experience on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know if Joe, you want to pass it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. So I'm Joe Kalis. In professional realms, I practice as an oncology pharmacist with UC Health here in the Front Range area of Colorado. So I'm based out of Colorado Springs, but really appreciative to be here today because I think no matter where we practice in medicine or what our personal experiences have been, like grief is part of that human experience. If we haven't encountered it in our lives, I think we will at some point. And being aware of like the different stages that you had mentioned and how to navigate through some of those, I think is a crucial skill that we can help support patients through or even support ourselves depending on what each day brings. So glad to be here.
Well, hello. I'm Megan Claire Chase, aka Warrior Megzi. I'm an 8-year invasive lobular breast cancer survivor and patient advocate. I'm also the breast cancer program director and host of our BC Life for the nonprofit Share Cancer Support. And, when I think about grief, when I got my cancer diagnosis, I never thought about seeing friends die. No one prepared me for that. I'm also an adolescent and young adult survivor as well. I was diagnosed under 40, and to this day, I still remember the very first AYA cancer friend. She was only 32, visiting her in hospice, and that just really struck me because I was always in that fight or flight mode, and you never hear about how seeing your friends that you make. And so many of the friendships in the cancer space are so deep and so impactful very quickly because of what you're going through. But then how it often feels like there is no real goodbye, so to speak. And I've struggled with that and trying to understand that grief that I didn't realize I would end up going through and continuously going through, right? And then there's also another grief that I have is like my body grief. I don't even look the same externally. My hair came back curly. And so when you hear people saying, "Oh, you look so great, you look so great," but what I see is like a death of who I was or what I looked like that I liked externally, and trying to process that, the grief of losing body parts, the body parts that made me biologically a woman. There was a grief there that I was not prepared to go through.
And I think all those different aspects are something that there really isn't a ton of awareness of, because my role is somewhat unique in that after a patient is receives their diagnosis from one of our practitioners, I'll sit down with them and then review what their treatment's going to be like. And it often comes out, I don't know if it just we have a more time to discuss it or maybe personality differences or whatnot, but I often find that patients do start to describe and hopefully begin to process some of these stages like denial about the cancer. But what you're describing, Megzi, is just it's so real, but it's something that I don't think that there's a lot of awareness both for patients or even in the medical side of these are different things that patients or even ourselves do have to contend with.
Yeah, I was in thinking about, the discussion today, I was and as I'm getting ready to go to clinic later today, I thought about a specific patient that I had that I saw and really just came in for a vaccination, like quick flu shot. Um, and it was the summertime, getting those vaccinations before school starts, had on a tank top. And so I saw the port scar. And I remember asking, like, "Oh, like, is that a port scar?" And then, immediately, and this was a young adult, female, and said, "Yeah, I went through lymphoma treatment about like it was 5 years ago." And I was like, "Wow, wow!" And this was before I was diagnosed, and I ended up being diagnosed with the same lymphoma a few months after that. But when we talk about the stages of grief and the way that I heard her talk about, and really she was at the stage of acceptance, and she was 5 years out of treatment, and she was like, "Yeah, it was something in my life, and I'm healthy now. I'm making sure I stay up to date on all my vaccinations." And I was like, "That's great." Immediately when I was diagnosed, I remember I thought about her, and it really wasn't until this conversation where I'm thinking of like comparing the stages that I was at with her and really thinking like, I just need to get there. I need to get to that accept. I know there's going to be a lot of work that gets there, but I saw her in a primary care clinic. I didn't see her in an oncology clinic. Like there's hope in that. And so yeah, so thank you both because your introductions and really talking about your experiences with grief and as a patient, as a provider too, helped me to reflect on that. So as much as we need this for patients and for others too, I think this is a really cathartic thing for ourselves in this conversation.
Couldn't agree more.
Very much so. And as we're talking now, it had a phrase from a novel I read recently. It's kind of an older one. It's called The Moviegoer by a Southern writer named Walker Percy. But there was a quote in there about how it wasn't in relation to grief, but I think it really applies well here. It was talking about how the enduring of something, you can't write it off. You simply have to go through whatever it is you're enduring. And then I'm thinking now of how that relates to the different stages of grief and how that might not be a straightforward path to walk. It might be moving to one and then back, or yeah, think too of like the first leukemia patient I became close with. It was like brand new practitioner. You know what you're doing and you're ready to take on the world. And then you encounter some of those human experiences. You're like, my goodness, I wasn't prepared for this. What do I do? And thinking about how, like, even to this day, 13, 14 years later, like, I'll hear a song that I associated with her and it still makes me tear up. Like it's an ongoing process. It's not something that I think you can open and close a book on. And I wanted to make sure we shed some light on that.
I totally agree with that. Um, and also, I have my mother. She has a rare blood cancer, and another, type of grief that I was not expecting either was anticipatory grief. I realized this. It was only a few months ago that I realized I was already talking with her, and everything I was doing was like anticipating her imminent death. She's not at death's door right now, but seeing her and seeing the physical changes, now that I have been, as I like to say, in a relationship with no evidence of disease, Ned, and I look healthy externally, and I'm starting to see her look physically weaker, physically sicker. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's not there yet. So try and stay in the present. But then I have my friends still dying. So it's like I'm trying to deal with that. I'm trying to deal with like the endless and sad and frustrating cycle of friends in the cancer space, and then friends who are not in cancer land, as I like to call it, dying. And then I'm like, well, why am I still here? So I start to get very that survivor's guilt as well, because I'm like, I don't have human children. I'm not married. I'm an only child. And then I started grieving for myself when I realized, oh my God, who's going to be there for me when ultimately I'm going to start going through things? And so I agree, there is no time limit on grief or the different types of grief. And I think that's what a lot of people, it's unexpected. You don't realize how many different types of grief based on the people that you're talking about, the situation that you're in. So I'm trying to find ways too to cope, and I have a fantastic therapist as well. But it's just been really enlightening, but also just when I'm starting to think I'm at that tail end of grieving for someone or a friend, find out another one has died. And there's no like space.
I think you hit on a key idea there of trying to remain in the present, like in some of the own self-directed therapy, if you will, or even in discussions with other professionals. The idea I found it in like the Stoic philosophy of the ancient Greeks of like trying to remain in that present moment, and sometimes that's the hardest thing to do because we don't know what's coming next. We only know what came before and the things we assign to that. But even still, it's so trying to find the right words for it. I'm struggling at the moment, but finding that like different ways of processing. I found some patients I've worked with, they need to talk through things and express it and have validation. Others, myself included, it's more of a physical type of processing. Like I might need to go ride a bike for 2 or 3 hours straight before I can say, I think I'm starting to work through this. Or something along those lines of just the way the body and the mind end up being connected.
Yeah, Joe, you got to um, something I wanted to bring up in kind of like our own, what we found to help, what we've done ourselves, what we recommend for patients, what we've seen other survivors, warriors do. We talked about with therapy, we talked about mental health support. Um, I, I recommend support groups to other AYAs, and that can come in the form of formalized support groups at cancer centers or even those run by community-based organizations that may be related to specific types of cancer experiences or different identities of cancer survivors. And I think that just kind of speaks to the fact that everyone grieves differently. We all mentioned everyone processes differently. And that can be really hard too when you see a friend, a colleague, a patient grieving, um, and um, and may not know the right solution for them, but you can offer, a myriad of resources. So I don't know if there's others that we talked about, physical activity. I think that's great. um, and I know I'm just thinking about a lot of, um, uh, you know, like retreat. I took part in like a Kripalu yoga kind of meditation yoga retreat. I was really into hot yoga that right after my treatment. Um, and that was great for me. It wasn't geared specifically to cancer survivors, and it was kind of just those that wanted to, um, explore themselves and take time for themselves a bit more. So, um, I think that's something to note, that there's different ways to process grief, and there's different communities that you can do that within. And so, I don't know if others
Yeah.
have anything to add.
Yeah, so something that I started doing probably 3 years ago, when I realized, okay, this is going to be an endless cycle that just goes on and on, right? And so when I have those interactions, especially when it's virtual, getting to meet people from all over the world, what I started doing is screenshotting certain conversations when, like, I made them laugh, or they're like, that really helped me, or what have you. And I actually have a whole scrapbook of um, either text or messages on social media. And I go back and I read, so I have their words there forever with me. And it wasn't something I was initially thinking, oh, I must do this for when they die. It was more like, oh my God, I love that, was so funny. Let me just save that. Um, and then I put it together. And as I've like looked at it, it's like I do still have a piece of them. There's we had a connection, even if it was like something so brief. It was meaningful, it was impactful, and so I still have that. And maybe that's because I'm a creative, and I love writing, and I love it when I can make someone laugh even when it's talking about something very serious. So that is something I do. But another thing I did want to like also bring up is there is a sense of grief of what could have been, grieving over dreams or things that you did not even think you wanted until you got your medical team saying, you know what, we need to remove this or we need to remove that in order to keep you alive. And for me, it was children. I never really saw myself with any, and I think that's because, I'm chronically single. I was like, I'm not doing this by myself. What do you mean? I come from a divorced family. Like, I know the difficulties of that. And but then when I am told, oh, your body isn't responding to these medications. Oh, and with your family history of ovarian and cervical cancer, we need to, have a hysterectomy and an oophorectomy all before I was 40. And it was in that moment, honestly, I wasn't thinking about the grief that would occur, that emotional grief that would occur. I was just like, let's get it out. Let's do what we need to do, because I can't go through this again. I was in that kind of like frenzy. But then once I had the surgeries, literally I physically felt empty. Like I was like, oh my God, my insides are having to adjust because of all this empty space. That is something no one could have prepared me for. And it was in that moment where I was like, I think I actually would have wanted children. And then it turned out I couldn't have even had children once they went in. Some other, it was just like all these double slaps of grief of what could have been. What is going to be my legacy? Because I feel like single people are often left out of the conversation, even as we think of grief. And, especially as we start to get older, as adults, we may still be single. And especially if you're an only child like me, what is my legacy? Now I have no physical legacy, and that is a grief. And so I continue to have a digital legacy because I was like, how is anyone ever going to know I was here? But that's also like another grief. And I think you can't just define grief one way. It's so complex, and certain things you don't even realize will cause grief. And that's been really hard to deal with when you're dealing with yourself and then also others. So it's like multiple types of grief trying to process all at one time.
Hearing you talk makes me think of how the acuity of and the severity of a cancer diagnosis at any age affects, I wouldn't say typical grief, but how that impacts your own grieving in itself. Like you said, you're in fight or flight mode. You're just like, what is it? You're just surviving, not thriving. And it almost um disrupts that DABDA cycle, that grieving process. I don't know, Joe, if you've experienced that too as a provider, and seeing that you know you see patients kind of just like, I can't even think about that yet. I just need to get through this treatment and then I'll process it later.
I definitely have seen the patients, like they can be very detail or goal focused at first because it's like that's what they're able to process at that time. And as you're both describing, it may not be till after the fact at some unknown point in the future that those other types or other waves of grief come through. 'Cause I think that it can be something, challenging for those going through grief, but also too what perceptions of grief might exist for others. Like, oh, well, you survived cancer. Why are you still experiencing these things? It's not what someone else's expectation of grief could be or should be. And that's where I think the awareness is important, because we talk about different times when things might happen. I think back to early 2020, and we're talking about the pandemic and COVID, and I lost my maternal grandmother then, I think, to COVID or complications thereof. But she was in South Florida and we were here. And it's like trying to make those determinations in the moment of, well, I really feel a need to be there. But if I go, am I going to be able to come back? Am I going to be able to safely take care of patients? And it's still something like I'll probably struggle with that the rest of my life. But to someone from the outside, and like, oh, seems like you're doing great. You got through it. Sorry you lost your grandma. But I think there's so many aspects that are unaware of to those on the exterior, but also until I think you're in that moment and you're just sitting with the grief and having to try to find a way through it, that it really comes to light.
Oof, that just I've been sitting on this for a bit, and related to, my cousin who passed during the pandemic, and there's such a shame around stigma around suicide, and how that complicated grief of, pandemic things needed to be small, like if there could even be a celebration of life, or if there even could be a formal service. That decision was taken away, and so it was almost like the stigma around it magnified, and the shame around it magnified, because it's like, okay, we can't even, you know we can't even be together and celebrate this person. But I think there's so much that's like delayed grieving, Joe, like what you were saying with you know, your loss in your family with your grandmother, and that decision, that it's it's so hard. It's so hard to it's so hard to articulate. It's so hard to, because you also never know when it's going to come up again. And then, so I've kind of been in like this mindset of, okay, what's my toolkit? when this anniversary comes up, or if there's someone else that a close friend that calls and shares a story about their family member who died by suicide, like all these other triggers that can happen. What is in my toolkit to help support? What is my self-care that I'm practicing? But it's that I feel like has not been talked about, is the just the complicated grief as a result of the pandemic, and among other things, but then that fallout from that too. And yeah, it's a tough thing for patients, because like you said, then your decisions, if you
Mhm.
decided to, go to Florida, it's so
I
hard. And
think
then some days,
another,
yeah.
yeah, and I think culturally, at least in our current Western culture, there does seem to be this trend of almost suppress it. If you pretend it's not there, it'll just go away. And I think we can all attest to that. It's not actually the case, and it might even make things harder. So I think of that phrase again of just trying to sit with an emotion or sit with a patient who's experiencing that emotion. Sometimes just that presence is enough to find whatever the right path is to get through it.
Yeah. To go off of that, Joe, to grieve, you really have to be vulnerable. You have to practice. And I'm thinking of people in my life and family members, especially, where it's been even more protracted and complicated for them because they haven't gotten to the point where they can be vulnerable with that. And like you said, sit with that. And it's hard. It's so hard. But Maxie, I cut you off. So
Um, yes to all of that. And I'm actually going to add another layer. Um, I'm a Black woman. And so dealing with the constant murders um, in our community, and how that stress on top of friends and family, if you're, I'm a deeply empathetic person. And so it's like when you're thinking of your toolbox and triggers, how we as patients, well, our color affects us every single day, every moment of the day. It affects our access to care. It affects our relationships with our doctors. So, when we say be vulnerable, we don't always feel we are safe enough to be vulnerable in talking with other patients, especially if they do not look like us. And there is a whole added layer of, and I can only really specifically talk about the Black community, where we are constantly in grief. We're constantly grieving over and over again. And then how that impacts our stress levels, and doctors saying, oh, you just need to reduce your stress level. It's like, how can you? And then you have a cancer diagnosis, and then you're having to accept grief of certain things about your own self, your dreams, your aspirations. And then you've got friends and family dying, and then you got the world, and it's like, it's a lot. And I have not figured out the perfect tools in a toolkit for having to deal outside of the cancer space. um, I try and do what I can, but it's also super isolating too, because inevitably someone will say, you know not everything is about race. Grief isn't about race. Well, yeah, it is.
Just really touches on in the multiple facets of grief that can happen, and the experiences that each of us has as individuals or as community members or as patients, as practitioners. Like, we've all got those layers of identity, and at the end of the day, us as people have to still try to find a way to reconcile all of that and bring it together in some way that I think allows us to keep moving forward, whatever that looks like for each of us. I think as we approach maybe one of those natural conclusion points for our discussion today, and I'll pose the question to each of you, but what what is one thought you might want to leave our audience with today, whether that's with respect to awareness of grief or tools you found that are helpful for you to process that maybe resonate with somebody else? But what might be one thought you'd want our audience to leave with?
I would say recognize that grief can come in waves, and it could be a multitude of griefs, but they may come today or they may come in 5 years. And to not feel down on yourself for not being able to get over it, because you don't have to get over it. What you have to do is continue moving forward, but you don't forget. And I think that is really key. And finding different ways of remembering, if it is a person, remembering them. And you may not always get a chance to have an official goodbye. And trying to process that and just know that you can still love them and you can still love yourself, because it can be hard, that acceptance, when you're grieving for your personal self and loss. You still matter. And I think that is the biggest thing I want people to take away from this conversation.
Yeah, it's a great closing question, Joe. So thank you for that, and made me think a lot. And then I'm like, oh my gosh. um, Similar to Megsy's thoughts, I wanted to reiterate that, you as a person may be at a very different phase than others grieving over the same loss. Um, and I think that the biggest advice that I can give, or that I try to really practice with patients, with family members, with friends, um, is the acceptance and just the support that you should be showing to others during their grieving process. I think it's easy to say that this person should be at this phase because it's been X amount of time, or because they didn't know this there's so many assumptions that you can make, but the best thing that you can do for yourself and for the other person is to support and to accept their grieving process. So and to offer mental health support. We know it's hard to find therapists, but offer in any way.
The support so important in professional therapist, friends, family, whatever that support network looks like for each person. And I think what I would leave the audience with, to kind of hearing you both and trying to reflect on that, and like what could I possibly add to it? Maybe just the thought that each of us encounters grief in different ways in different situations. We talked about the different layers of grief and how they can all compound each other. I think for our audience, I want to leave them with just the thought of perhaps try to release any expectations they may have of what grief could look like or should look like, or it ought to be this, it ought to be that. Like, every person's journey is going to be different. Try to identify where that person might be and meet them where they are, and then help support them through it. Thanks to you both for being here today, for being vulnerable, as we talked about. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, but I'm personally very hopeful that those in the audience will recognize that and then hopefully receive some of that support in their own way.
Same.
If we were in person, I'd be giving you both a big hug.
Right?